Hey, fifth graders. All right, so this is going to be lesson 5, but obviously first we have to do lesson 4's answer key. So this answer key might have, just my shirt there. So this one might have given you guys a little bit of trouble. It actually kind of gave me a little bit of trouble, and I have the book in front of me and was the one who just read it, as then turned around and started doing the answers. So yeah, anyway, but I think I figured out all the answers. I did not use my official answer key thing that comes with the teacher's manual, but I feel fairly confident these are all right. So anyway, number 1, the Cold War was fought with, the answer is C, ideas, money, and words. Except for occasionally when we used guns to fight it, like in Korea, but that's neither here nor there. Number 2, why did the United States go to war with Korea in the 1950s? Well, first of all, we didn't go to war with Korea. We went to war with North Korea, which is not, I mean, Korea sounds like it's the whole thing, but anyway, with North Korea in the 1950s, and it was A, to stop the spread of communism, also because South Korea was one of our allies and they didn't want to be conquered. So, we were also doing that. Number 3, the Berlin Wall symbolized the difference between A, communism and democracy. Number 4, when communist troops from North Korea invaded South Korea, who was sent to stop them, and then why? Okay, so if you went back, what I said was soldiers from the United States, and there were 16 other UN countries. But basically, as long as you say the United States, and then maybe other countries or the United Nations, something like that. That was where the soldiers came from, and why? The book is going to tell you that it was to stop the spread of communism, but also, again, it was because, that was probably one of the bigger reasons, but also because South Korea was one of our allies, and we didn't want them being taken over. Number 5, what was the purpose of NATO when it was formed in 1949? So the purpose of NATO was to stop the spread of communism. If you recall, I said that the Soviet Union and some of its allies formed the Warsaw Pact, just kind of on the flip side, basically to, not really to stop the spread of democracy, but more just as a way to protect themselves from NATO. Okay, so the vocabulary is actually where I had the most trouble, in particular with number 3 and 4, so we'll see how you guys did. Number 1, Sputnik was a Soviet satellite, an object that circles another object. Number 2, in communism, the government owns all property and resources. Okay, so number 3, many Americans were afraid of nuclear attack during the, so initially I was like, oh, well, it's during the arms race, and then I kind of looked at it and I thought that maybe number 4 was going to be arms race, but in figuring it all out, eventually I came up with number 3 is in fact arms race. So many Americans were afraid of nuclear attack during the arms race. Number 4, the Cold War era was a period of history when countries competed to develop weapons. So you might think the Cold War arms race because they're making weapons, right? So that's an arms race. But it's the fact that it was a period of history is what they were using to try and get you to see era. I thought that maybe they'd made a mistake and they just were supposed to have Cold War as one of the vocabulary words, that number 3 would be Cold War and number 4 would be arms race. But no, 3 is arms race, 4 is era. Number 5, a truce is an agreement to stop fighting. So there's that, and then let's get on with the unit. Okay, so lesson 5 is called A Time of Change, and here's kind of a picture. This is part of the civil rights movement, of course. Okay, part A is separate but not equal. After World War II, news of the Holocaust shocked people throughout the world. As a result, many Americans began to question discrimination that was happening in the United States. Okay, probably partly. I think one of the biggest things is that African Americans were in Europe and discovered that people of African descent in Europe were treated better there than they were in the United States. And they weren't treated as like second-class citizens. They weren't segregated, anything like that. And so then they come back to the United States. They've been soldiers, they've been fighting for their country, and they come back to the United States and they're treated not very nicely. And so I think a lot of the push for equality, you read many Americans began to question discrimination that was happening in the United States. And basically it sounds like, oh, white people felt bad. That was not the case. I think black people got sick of being treated poorly and started pushing for it. And then as they pushed for it, that caused white people to start questioning it. I'm not saying that the Holocaust didn't have at least something to do with it. Certainly, as people learned that this was, in Germany, these people were being treated very badly and being discriminated against. And then we kind of start looking in the mirror and being like, oh, are we discriminating? Are we doing similar things, not maybe murdering 6 million people, but doing similar things to people in our own country? So that might have happened. But I think also a lot of it was that African Americans really started to push for, wait a minute, we put our lives on the line. We were dying just the same as anybody else for the cause that we believed in. And in Europe, we were finding that we were being treated more fairly there. Now we're coming back to the United States and we expect to be treated properly here too. So I kind of I don't super disagree with that little top blurb, but at the same time, I think that maybe there was more important things that were causing it, as opposed to just people being like, oh, the Holocaust was bad, let's treat black people nicely. I don't think that's quite what was happening. All right. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that separate but equal conditions were constitutional. So this is, you can have black people have to work over here, go to school over here, whatever. White people will be over here. Yes, they're separate from each other, but supposedly they're equal. Usually they weren't actually equal, but supposedly they are. And the Supreme Court had ruled that was okay. But of course, now it's been 60 years and people are starting to re-look at that and think that maybe that wasn't actually okay. This allowed racial segregation of schools. Schools remained separate but not equal. In 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is known as the NAACP, that's probably what you hear it called most often nowadays, was founded to fight discrimination and segregation. So segregation becomes illegal. NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall took on several cases of people who wanted to end school segregation. The issue made it to the Supreme Court with Brown versus the Board of Education. On May 17th, 1954, so as I'm recording this, that would be a week ago, roughly. And then obviously, let's see, 66 years ago, a week ago today, 66 years ago, was when that was decided. Let's see. So on May 17th, 1954, the Supreme Court overturned Plessy versus Ferguson and school segregation became illegal. So here is a picture of Thurgood Marshall there. And he actually, after being a lawyer and taking on these cases and arguing in the Supreme Court about this, he later becomes a Supreme Court justice himself from 1967 until 1991. So a little bit before I went into high school is when Thurgood Marshall, I think he died while he was serving as a Supreme Court justice. He was old by that point. Supreme Court justices, by the way, are you're appointed to the Supreme Court and that's for life. Which is one of the reasons why Republicans and Democrats really fight over who gets in and that sort of thing, because, if you have a Democrat president, they're going to put somebody up to go to the Supreme Court who tends to agree with them on a lot of things. And it's like having that guy, the person is president, those political views, those are there for the rest of that person's life. So if you put up somebody who is relatively young as a Supreme Court justice, then they're a Supreme Court justice, potentially for the next 50 or more years. And so a lot of politicians and stuff really are concerned about how the Supreme Court is, like what the makeup of the Supreme Court is. Is it mostly conservative, which tends to be more Republican? Is it mostly liberal, which tends to be more Democrat? That sort of thing. So that's as you guys get older, you'll realize that that's one of the big fights that's almost always going on. Anyway. So the Montgomery bus boycott. The fight against segregation spread. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, an African-American, boarded a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She sat in a seat in the back of the bus reserved for African-Americans. As the bus filled, the driver changed the whites-only section to include Parks' seat. He ordered Parks to give up her seat. That was the law. Parks refused and was arrested. In protest, the NAACP organized a bus boycott. For nearly a year, protesters drove to work in carpools or walked. Finally, in November 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was illegal. In 1960, African American college students staged sit-ins at lunch counters for whites only. They refused to leave until they were served or arrested. Court cases followed. As a result, restaurants in 126 American cities were desegregated. So basically, with the situation with the bus, and then also with the situation with these basically restaurants, African Americans started to realize that even if they didn't necessarily have political power to protest the way they were being treated and things like that, they had economic power. African Americans, there was a lot of African Americans living in cities, and buses are very important in cities. You have to pay to ride the bus. And so consequently, if you have a large portion of your people who at one point were riding the bus and then say, nope, forget that, we don't like what you're doing, we're not going to ride the bus, that's money out of the pockets of these bus companies. And so, as time goes on, they either have to start charging their white customers more, or they have to give in to the demands of the African Americans. And they couldn't charge the white customers more, basically. The white people weren't going to do that. So consequently, what they decided was it's just easier to desegregate. It'd be nice if it was like, hey, we're desegregating, and all of a sudden everybody was like, yay, okay, we can get along, white people and black people sitting next to each other. That's sadly not the way it happened, but they did desegregate, and nowadays people ride the bus, and who cares who you're sitting next to? Actually, nobody wants to sit next to anybody, but if somebody sits next to you, you're like, I don't care what color their skin is. You just hope that they don't smell bad. So that's where we're at now. And then with the sit-ins, kind of same thing. It got to the point where these restaurants just felt like it was easier to just desegregate rather than putting up with the fighting and that sort of thing. So, but for these college kids, and also, for Rosa Parks and things like that, like, these people were being arrested. They stood up for what they believed in, and as a result, they were mistreated and they were arrested. They were put in jail. Some of them for longer than others, probably not super long, but they also usually had to pay fines, and it became a big hassle. It was a big hassle for them as well, but they just believed so strongly in it that they were willing to do that, to, one, bring attention to their cause, and two, to force these companies to realize that they could not do what they were doing. Part B, fighting for change. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist minister, was one of the organizers of the Montgomery bus boycott. By 1963, this civil rights leader organized many protests against segregation, including protests in Birmingham, Alabama, one of the most segregated cities in the United States. So March on Washington. In August 1963, King and other civil rights leaders led 250,000 people in the March on Washington. They demanded job opportunities and civil rights law. King gave a speech that spoke of his dream for a world free of prejudice. Read part of his speech on this page. So then we've got it over here. So I'll show you. There's the speech, which you can find easier online. There's a picture of King with, so this is the Washington Monument back here. He is actually standing on the steps of or he's standing right in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And there's this big lake, reflecting lake that's right there. But so these people crowded around here, and he gave this speech. And so his speech is this. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This will be the day when all God's children will be able to sing with a new meaning. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty. Of thee I sing, land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. So that was a section from the I Have a Dream speech that he gave on August 20th, 1963 in Washington, D.C. So, and creed, which was one of the things that he said in there, the true meaning of its creed, and then we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So a creed is a stated belief, and of course that quote, he's quoting the Declaration of Independence, which the United States wrote at that point just a little less than 200 years earlier. So anyway, the March on Washington was a great moment for the civil rights movement. Soon afterward, President John F. Kennedy asked Congress to pass a federal civil rights bill. He did not live to see the bill become law. On November 22nd, 1963, the president was in Dallas, Texas. He was riding in a convertible so the crowd could see him. Shots were fired and hit Kennedy. Although the car sped to the hospital, the president was dead. He was shot in the head, so speeding up with the car wasn't going to save him. He died. His body might have stayed alive, but basically when those shots hit him, he was pretty much almost instantly dead. John F. Kennedy was actually, I believe he was campaigning at the time when that happened, or maybe starting to. But it was a pretty tragic thing. Your grandparents probably remember where they were when they heard that John F. Kennedy had been killed. That was actually, we have, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but there's a lot of people who are assassinated during this time. In addition to John F. Kennedy, his brother Robert Kennedy is also assassinated several years later, but still within that same decade. And then, of course, Martin Luther King is assassinated, and Malcolm X, who was another civil rights leader, was also assassinated. So, a lot of assassinations going on. It was kind of this crazy time. It was a time of great change, and sometimes during times of great change, you can have a lot of violence that's either associated with it, caused by it, or even caused by those who are trying to resist it. It's just kind of one of those things. But this kind of the 1960s, we had a lot of issues with violence. Just is. Anyway, so the Civil Rights Act. After Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson became president. He worked to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The law made it illegal for employers to discriminate or show prejudice against someone because of race, color, religion, nationality, or gender. Prejudice is a negative opinion formed without proof. So, Civil Rights Act is one of the vocabulary words, so you'll need to know basically that the Civil Rights Act made it illegal for people to discriminate against other people. Prejudice is basically it's a negative opinion formed without proof, I guess is the definition that they give you there. So those are our two vocabulary words. Those are the first two vocabulary words, though we will have another one coming up here very quickly. Anyway, even with the Civil Rights Act, unfair and illegal practices, such as charging taxes at voting places, still existed in the South. This led Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So this is another vocabulary word or vocabulary phrase. This law allowed federal agents to use their power to make sure all citizens were allowed to vote. So again, kind of just like we had back in the right after the Civil War, the South was really trying to limit the voting of African Americans, and probably other places, probably not strictly just the South, though I think maybe the South was the worst about it because of the Confederacy and all that stuff. Even though that was 100 years ago, but they were still kind of hung up on it, still sometimes hung up on it today. The war on poverty. In 1964, more than 1 in 5 Americans lived in poverty. So to be clear, when it says lived in poverty, that does not mean that they necessarily lived in, a slum or anything like that. You can live in a house and still be considered to be in poverty. It just means that you make below a certain amount of money, essentially, is what living in poverty is. To solve this problem, President Johnson declared a quote-unquote war on poverty. Johnson wanted to build what he called the Great Society that provided health care and education to all Americans. One program that was passed was Medicare. It helps people over age 65 pay for medical attention. By the middle of the 1960s, the civil rights movement had registered thousands of voters. Lunch counters, schools, and other public places had been integrated. Conditions for many African Americans, however, had not improved. More than half lived in poverty. In 1968, King launched a, quote, poor people's campaign to call attention to poverty among African Americans. There were people who thought that King's nonviolent approach was no longer useful. Some African Americans listened to another leader named Malcolm X. At first, Malcolm X said that working with whites would not achieve equal rights for African Americans. By 1964, however, Malcolm X believed that people of all races could work together for change. Violence took the lives of both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. An assassin killed Malcolm X in the spring of 1965. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was in the city of Memphis, Tennessee to support a strike. Shots rang out and King was assassinated. So Malcolm X was giving a speech and he was actually killed by black people. He had been part of a group called the Nation of Islam. And while there's, I don't think, proof officially, it is very, 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 very incredibly likely that the Nation of Islam is the ones who assassinated Malcolm X. Martin Luther King, though, was killed by a man who was a white supremacist. He believed white people were better than black people. His name was James Earl Ray. And then both, we talked about JFK and his brother Robert Kennedy. Both of them were also killed by white assassins. In fact, in both of those cases, I don't think either of those necessarily had anything to do with civil rights or anything like that. I think that was whole other issues involved there. The whole JFK thing, that man, if you want to read about that, that is a rabbit hole you can fall down with all the people's, or with everybody's different, not everybody, with some people's very strongly held beliefs in all sorts of cover-ups and what was really going on and how many people, how many assassins were there? Maybe there was one, maybe there was, dozens. There's lots of conspiracy theories about who he was killed, like really killed by and why. However, probably the truth of the matter is that he was killed by the guy that they caught and, charged him with being killed by. Anyway. And so here we have, sorry, I'll show you some of these pictures. This is Coretta Scott King. That's Martin Luther King's wife. Down here, this is John F. Kennedy. And this is Lyndon B. Johnson as he's being sworn in. The woman that's standing right next to him, that is Jacqueline Kennedy. Later remarried and became Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, but she was John F. Kennedy's wife, and she was sitting right next to him when he was killed. And she's standing there next to Lyndon B. Johnson as he's sworn in after her husband has died. So, let's see. All right, so part C is equal rights for all. After 1960, more groups sought equal rights. Protests were organized for improved working conditions and equal pay. So the next section is helping migrant workers. One group that protested during the 1960s was migrant farm workers. This is a vocabulary phrase, I guess. Migrant farm workers travel from farm to harvest crops. These workers face dirty and dangerous working conditions for little pay. In 1962, two Mexican Americans, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, I think is how you say her name, organized a labor union that later became the United Farm Workers, or UFW. The union led strikes and boycotts against farm owners. In time, the efforts of the UFW brought higher wages and better working conditions to migrant workers. Okay, so, this side. So right here, we have, I think this right here is Cesar Chavez. These women are marching for more rights for women, basically. But these guys, this is part of the protest, the strike against farms. So it's, kind of interestingly, migrant workers, generally speaking, were people who were allowed to be in the country. But nowadays, one of the issues that we have is you have people who are illegally in the country. So they're called illegal immigrants. They're people who've come often from the southern border, though it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. But they've come into the United States, and then they can't work, I guess, regular jobs. They can't work jobs that, where you have a salary and you have a bank account and they send money to your bank account, things like that, the way that people who are here legally can do. And so consequently, a lot of times they are working just for cash from, they'll hang out somewhere and people who need workers will come over and say, hey, I need 3 guys, and they'll just pick 3 people to come and do whatever job. In that case, a lot of times you have people who they are not getting paid a quote unquote fair wage because basically they're here illegally. They can't argue, hey, you have to pay me more money. The guy can say, hey, yeah, I actually just called immigration control on you guys, so bye. So kind of have sort of another issue here still with the kind of the migrant workers, of people who have traveled. This is migrant workers are not immigrant workers or illegal immigrant workers. However, you still kind of have this, people who are working on farms are just doing kind of like full-time, I have this job for, weeks or months or years, but people who are just maybe going and just getting hired on to work for 1 day or 2 days or something like that still struggle to be paid fairly, and, things like that, just because in the case of illegal immigrants, because they don't really have protection because they are not here legally. So anyway, still sort of an issue, I guess. The women's movement. Women gained the right to vote in 1920, but many women still said that they did not have economic equality. In 1960, women were paid less than men doing the same jobs. In 1966, writer Betty Friedan formed the National Organization for Women, NOW, or NOW. So NOW insisted that the government enforce the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made it illegal to discriminate against women in the workplace. In 1972, Congressman Patsy Mink wrote a law giving women equal rights in education. This law, first known as Title IX, expanded women's sports programs in schools. In 2002, the law was renamed in honor of Patsy Tokomoto Mink. Rights for Native Americans. In 1968, a group organized the American Indian Movement, AIM, which worked for equal rights and the improvement of living conditions. It also drew attention to poverty on reservations, which still today, I played on a sports team in New Mexico, and we would play against several reservation schools, and reservation schools were even just the town, you drive into these towns that were, part of this reservation, and the towns just tended to look poor and kind of run down. It's still an issue to this day. It drew attention to poverty on reservations. After many protests, the Supreme Court ruled that states had to honor treaty agreements. As a result, millions of acres were returned to Native Americans in Alaska, Maine, New Mexico, and South Dakota during the 1970s. And people with disabilities, oh my goodness, this is a long section. For years, millions of Americans with disabilities faced discrimination at work, education, housing, and transportation. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, made it illegal to discriminate against people who are disabled. It also required the removal of barriers that prevent disabled people from gaining access to public facilities. So now you read this and you might think like, oh, barriers to keep people from having access to public facilities. They were putting up fences around these and saying like, if you're disabled, you can't come in. That's not what it means. What it means is more like, hey, if you have stairs leading up into your school, how is somebody in a wheelchair supposed to get into that school? That is a barrier. So this required businesses and things like that. If you have to go upstairs to get into your business, or even if you build a house and there's stairs to get up into the house, sometimes they were required to create a wheelchair access. Now, not necessarily for houses, obviously. If you have a house and it has stairs, then that's your own business. But schools, public offices, even, businesses, places that people are working, they're required to have some way for a handicapped person to get into that building, if they need to get into that building. And it can't just be like, oh, we promised to send somebody up there to pick you up or anything like that. Like, no, there has to be a ramp. There has to be some way for them to get in. It's also why you see a lot of doors that are like automatic doors, or where you can just push a button and it opens up, that sort of thing. Those are all basically to help people who are disabled, and also sometimes to help those of us who are lazy and don't want to open up the door. But that all kind of comes from this right here, which didn't happen until the 1990s. So that was when I was about you guys' age. All right. So now we're jumping back in time a little bit. We've just been talking, things that were happening even in the 90s, but now we're back in time with the Vietnam War. So more than 10,000 miles from the fight for equal rights in the United States, a bloody fight was raging, the Vietnam War. This war divided many Americans. North Vietnam was a communist nation supported by the Soviet Union and China. South Vietnam was a republic backed by the United States. The United States worried that if Vietnam became entirely communist, other Asian countries would fall to communism. We worried about that. It did not end up being the case. But I think there's a statistic out there that, so the United States obviously participates in the Vietnam War a lot. We killed, I think, more people than actually existed in North Vietnam at the time. So we were not fighting just the North Vietnamese. We were fighting probably the Chinese mostly. Vietnam just kind of comes right off of China. So a lot of Chinese troops were in there helping the North Vietnamese. And so the United States was fighting in Vietnam, but really we were basically fighting China and Russia. And it was not a good war for us to have been in. And it's kind of a little bit Korea-ish. I mean, there was this divide between North and South. South was allied with the United States and was this republic and a democracy, or a democratic republic anyway. And then the North was communist and was allied with China and also to an extent Russia. And again, we had fighting there, but in this case, this one does not go as well for us as the Korean War did. All right, so in August 1964, President Johnson announced that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had fired on 2 American warships in the Gulf of Tonkin. What Johnson did not say was that the American warships were helping South Vietnam to spy and conduct raids on North Vietnam. After the North Vietnamese attacked a military base in South Vietnam, killing 7 Americans and wounding 100, President Johnson responded. Less than 14 hours after the attack, some 132 American aircraft bombed North Vietnam. By the end of 1966, 450,000 American troops were fighting an all-out war there. So this war, actually somewhat, I mean, obviously there's a lot of key differences here, but there are some similarities to this war and the Revolutionary War, just in the way that the groups are using tactics. The United States at this point, of course, is a formal military, so we are operating regular battle strategy, that sort of thing. North Vietnam, however, does not really have, I mean, they have soldiers, of course, but they're using guerrilla tactics. So, popping out from behind trees, that sort of thing. Not fighting the way, quote unquote, you should. North Vietnam also uses a lot of really, I mean, they were desperate, obviously, when you're fighting against one of the superpowers in the world and you are tiny as North Vietnam, or just all of Vietnam is, you've got to do what you've got to do. But there were stories of Americans shooting children and things like that. That was happening because some of these children would come up and want to give the Americans hugs, and they had a grenade and would blow themselves up and kill the Americans. And so it got to the point where Americans were like, don't come near us or we will shoot you, because we don't know if you're trying to kill us or not. We don't know who's on our side, because you're not fighting against a whole bunch of people wearing uniforms that clearly label themselves as part of North Vietnam. Instead, you've got people who are, civilians. You've got people in houses who come out of their houses and it turns out they have guns and they start shooting at you. And so this was a very yucky war that the United States got tangled up in. We tangled ourselves up in it, and it was kind of a mess. Protesting the war. Americans became deeply divided over the war. shocker if you've paid attention to modern war issues like the war on terror. Oh, no, we were all totally on board with that one, right? So people called hawks believed the United States had to fight North Vietnam to stop communism from spreading. Those called doves believed that the United States should not fight in a war where its own safety was not threatened. In 1969, more than 250,000 protesters came to Washington, D.C. to speak out against the war. Soon, President Richard M. Nixon withdrew some troops, but the war continued. In 1973, U.S. troops stopped fighting in Vietnam, but they continued to help South Vietnamese troops. In 1975, North Vietnam won the war, and Vietnam was united under a communist government. In the 2 decades of fighting, nearly 2 million Vietnamese people were killed. More than 57,000 Americans died in the war. So that is the end of this. Apparently we're going to skip a whole lot of stuff here. So actually, you know what? Maybe I'll just cover this in the next chapter. That's probably the best way to do this. Okay. So anyway, that's it for this. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. Good luck on the packet, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.